Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Let us resume our discussion on dualism. As you all know that Descartes is advocating the substance dualism, and in the last class I mentioned that we will be discussing the criticism of Ryle and John Searle with reference to Descartes' substance dualism. We had briefly discussed about Gilbert Wright's criticism, that is how Descartes commits categoric mistake. Descartes is being debated and discussed for last probably more than 400 years now, and the problem of dualism is becoming a perennial problem in philosophy of mind. Now, how does Descartes commit category mistake? Descartes commits this category mistake because Descartes puts mind and the body into two different framework, and for him they are categorically distinct from each other. Now, this was not acceptable to many, and Ryle, understanding the difficulties that Descartes is committing, points out that this is a category mistake. Now, category mistakes becomes a problematic one because Descartes does not see the interaction between the mind and the body, and this interaction has to be a logical interaction. This interaction is not to be governed by the existence of God or any other mystical power. So, therefore, Ryle points out that mind has to be located in the body and has to be exhibited in our voluntary actions. Mind is not a mystical entity. Mind is something that is shown in our everyday activities, nothing hidden. As I mentioned, that one of the questions was about, is there something hidden? Ryle was certainly referring to the Freudian notion of mind, which says that there is a subconscious mind, and this subconscious mind is not given to our consciousness, and that remains an important category for Freud, because the subconscious mind sometimes can control and the conscious mind, and the subconscious mind perform voluntary actions which are known to the conscious mind. As you know, there are many movies sought in this particular problem of Freudian unconsciousness. Now, let us not go into that right now, probably we will come back to this little later in our lecture. What is the significance of Freudian consciousness? But today we are going to resume our discussion on the problem of dualism, precisely giving two things in our mind. One is whether Ryle's criticism against Descartes is a little problematic and how far it is acceptable to others. And second one is, as I mentioned earlier, that we will be also discussing about Searle's criticism to Descartes' concept of mind. Does dualism prevail is a question mark, and with all these criticisms, let us look at the difficulties that Ryle commits. Now, Hofstadter, in one of his paper, Ryle on category mistake, writes, I would summarize the kind of problem. I find there are three important problems Hofstadter is mentioning. One is that Ryle is making a brilliant attack on mentalism in general and dualism in particular. And the second one is, dualism is not a factual mistake for Ryle, it is a logical mistake, and the logical mistake is based on the problem of the study of logic of language. As you know, during that time MacDonald points out in one of his paper, and all this paper published in 1951 after Ryle's work, the famous work, The Concept of Mind, and many of them were discussing about Descartes' problem, and they were A.J. Ayer, Ludwig Wittgenstein and many others, and Ryle probably sharing their ideas with us. But this piece of work, The Concept of Mind, is a classic to the philosophical community who is working on philosophy of mind. Now, Ryle says that there is something problematic about the logic of language, the way language has been used. And another problem which Hofstadter finds is that Ryle is committing to some kind of a sophisticated naive behaviorism. Now, is it true that Ryle is committing to that kind of behaviorism? What is behaviorism? That we will be discussing little later. So, keeping all these 3 points in mind, let us look at what makes the bodily movement a voluntary one is a causal question for Hofstadter, and that is one important question which I was discussing yesterday. And this is one of the first disagreement with Ryle. Ryle says that how are the mental concepts applicable to human behavior is a question about causation of behavior. This is something very significant when we talk about how do we perform voluntary actions. Is this voluntary action are consciously performed or they are intentional, so on and so forth. Now, all intentional actions are conscious actions. All intentional actions are subject to our moral evaluation, whether being as a moral one must talk about or must say that whether this action is good or bad, right or wrong. This is how we evaluate, this is how we reflect on our actions. Now, Hofstadter points out that if somebody is performing an action, if somebody is behaving in a particular way, now these behaviors are certainly caused by something. Now, what is the cause of this action? One of the disagreement of Hofstadter with Ryle. The other one is it the behavior which is caused by the body and not by some kind of a non-material agency or the self Descartes discusses. Now, if it is caused by the body, then what is the causal principle? Now, according to Ryle, there are dispositions and subdispositions which can manifest into actions. So, the body has certain dispositional capacities, and these dispositional capacities cause action, cause behavior. Now, Ryle therefore, according to Hofstadter, is committing to some kind of a naive behaviorism. Now, behaviorism is a materialistic theory of mind. There are other materialistic theory of mind which we will be discussing in the next class. So, for example, functionalism is one of the materialistic schools of thought. So, let us think how does Ryle or overcome these issues. Probably for Ryle, as we talked about the second point, that Ryle was only talking about some kind of a analysis, or Ryle was giving to us some kind of analysis of the kind of concepts which were used by Descartes. So, that was something interesting. Ryle is not a behaviorist in the way we understand behaviorism. So, Ryle is not eliminating the concept of mind. Ryle is not reducing the concept of mind. Now, the question is Ryle giving an explanation of the concept of mind, or he is just describing the mental phenomena, say for example, volition, emotion, will, or all these concepts are dealt separately in different chapters in the particular classic called the concept of mind. Now, where Ryle gives an elaborate analysis of these concepts. Now, there is a distinction between philosophical explanation and the scientific explanation. Philosophical explanation is a kind of a description, whereas scientific explanation is some kind of a causal explanation. As you know, science follows the principle of causality and tries to find out what is the cause of a particular event. If the event is occurring in the world, then what is the cause of it? For Hofstadter, the question was whether Ryle is looking for the cause the way scientists are looking for the cause of mind, or he is just giving an analysis and the analysis is based on the logic of the language. Now, if that is true, then this kind of questions which Hofstadter is making, that what makes the bodily movement voluntary is a causal question, okay? Because look at the last sentence in Ryle's is a question about the causation of behavior. So, that was a point which Ryle is talking about, and that can be translated as this what makes the bodily movement voluntary. Now, the second disagreement which Hofstadter is having is that Descartes is not to be blamed for advocating dualism, because historically if you look at the concept of dualism, it has been advocated by the Stoics, it has been advocated by Plato, Aristotle and Augustine and many others. Okay. So, dualism is not an issue only with Descartes. Descartes is only trying to show us that how mind cannot be explained within the framework of a mechanistic worldview which is given by the science, and how can we talk about the mind with certainty that there exists something and that is a real one. How can we talk about such a self evident truth that mind exists? So, Descartes' endeavor is something very significant in that direction. If somebody tries to read Descartes from this point of view, I am sure that he would try to find out how Descartes' philosophical presuppositions are based on these epistemological concepts, as we mentioned: certainty, clarity, distinctness and self evidence. So, all this, if something is real, then they must fulfill all these characteristics, okay, and that will be that will give some kind of authenticity. So, but Ryle questions the authenticity of Descartes, because Ryle finds that this is some kind of a privileged access. Okay. It is the self is only privileged to have this access to the mind. So, the privileged access thesis talks about that only an individual is having this access to his private mind, and it is not accessible through the other, meaning thereby others will not know my mind. It is of course true that I am aware of my own thoughts, as all of you are aware of your thoughts. So, and it is true that we look at mind from our own point of view is something very important. We will come back to that, but what is important here is to note that dualism is not a problem with Descartes, rather dualism is been advocated, and Descartes is not to be blamed for this, that he is making a kind of a category mistake. So, that was Hofstadter's point. Let us see how do we explain actions. So, philosophical explanation, as I pointed out earlier, that it is descriptive rather than explanatory, because when we talk about human actions, when we talk about voluntary actions, now all these voluntary actions are having some kind of a purpose. Now, if they are teleologicals, and therefore, they cannot be explained only with reference to the kind of the nervous systems function like a cybernetic mechanism. So, they cannot be explained only with reference to the physiology of the body, the physiological function of the body. The physiological function is all right, say we do accept that there are no physiological functions which goes in accord with our thoughts. So, there is a kind of a harmony between the activities of the body and the mental activities. So, that harmony is not ruled out, but what is important is this, that most of the time when we talk about scientific explanations of the mind, we refer to the cybernetic mechanism or the mechanism that are there with reference to the anatomy, human anatomy or physiology, and they give evidences, and science goes with evidence, because evidence will show us how it can be proved, that this is what is happening. So, scientific analysis is mostly demonstrative. As you know, it can be viewed from a third person's point of view. So, the demonstrative attitude of science, it is explicitly present in Ryle. So, therefore, Ryle is trying to give an explanatory account rather than giving a kind of a descriptive account of the philosophy of mind. Now, what is descriptive and why description holds sound? On what context description holds sound is to be seen. Now, most of the cases when we talk about mind is not an observable phenomenon, it is not an observable facts. All observable facts are explained with the help of a theory. Science talks about a theory which explains the phenomenon. If mind is an unobservable fact, then certainly we cannot have an explanation of mind in the framework of science. So, therefore, we need to talk about a descriptive theory, probably will help us to talk about mind. So, that is something very interesting. So, that science deals with explanation, whereas philosophical explanations are different from scientific explanations. And you all know Wittgenstein's famous statement that philosophy is not science. Philosophy is either neither above or below science. So, the very fact that philosophy is not to be identified science. So, philosophical enterprise is something different, it is something unique, and for Wittgenstein philosophical explanations ought to be descriptive, because when we talk about scientific explanation, if we accept scientific explanation as something true and it is fundamental so far as the truth is concerned, then probably we will not see the significance of unobservable phenomenon like the mind. So, human mind, and as an unobservable fact, as an experiential fact, will be eliminated, will not be discussed as it has been discussed in philosophical theories. So, scientific theory eliminates probably the concept of mind. So, there is a danger in looking for a scientific explanation of the philosophical mind. So, philosophy has to differentiate itself the way it studies its own phenomenon. Now, why there will be mind? As I said, when we talk about voluntary actions, when we perform voluntary actions, we do perform it with this idea that there is something called a self, or there is something called an agent who is directing us, okay, and this direction with a purpose. Okay. So, there is a purpose in our actions. So, and that is why it is called voluntary actions. Now, look at now the way Hofstadter defines the concept of man. What is man, he says, and why this dualism? I quote Hofstadter: man exhibits certain characteristics in behavior, a complex persistence in variation, teleological unit, multiple tract dispositions, and so on, whereas stones do not. That is where human being is different from the other objects, other things in the world, other material bodies. And look at the next quotation: men are something more than the bodily, having something competent, as body is not, to make body behave intelligently, and this is soul. Now, what makes the body to behave intelligently is something interesting. So, there we can talk about, we can presuppose that there is somebody or there is something called soul, or there is something called mind which is directing us, and that is not to be explained when we talk about how there are multiple dispositions and the complexity of human body mechanisms. That is not the issue, rather how things are planned and how things are executed and so on and so forth. How do we imagine about the reality? All these are important. How do we rationalize our actions? How do we justify ourselves? Now, that is something interesting. That gives us a clue to understand these presuppositions, that there is something called mind and that is real. And Hofstadter says that it is like the pilot in the ship. He put it in the parenthesis. Without the pilot, the ship wanders aimlessly. Hofstadter mentions these lines. This sounds like Aristotelian and Platonic, because there is an end to life and human actions are directed towards that. So, there is a goal, there is a purpose. So, and these purposes make our actions teleological. There is a telos, there is a purpose in performing an action. So, now let us go back to Searle's criticism against Descartes. Now, so with this I will conclude Ryle's criticism that even if we talk about mind body dualism, we find that dualism is a kind of a problem that would go on in philosophical discourse, because looking at the Searle's criticism, Searle is raising this in his famous Wraith lecture series on mind body problem. The title of the book, which was published in 1984, Minds, Brains and Science by Harvard University Press. I will refer to Searle's this particular text, and the first chapter of this text tells us the mind body problem. Why dualism still remains is a fundamental question, because looking at Hofstadter and many others, we will find that mind is not something to be eliminated easily as it is. Probably mind as a substance is not acceptable to many others, and but what kind of dualism Searle thinks that it is inevitable in the discourse of philosophy of mind. So, therefore, Searle finds that there are two things which are incompatible, and probably that is something very problematic for Searle. One, there is a commonsensical picture, and the picture is that man is conscious, is free, mindful and rational agent, and the other one is that there is a scientific conception of the world, that everything in the world is constituted of certain material or physical particles. So, therefore, we encounter the problem of dualism, because on the one hand we find that there is a world, and the world is constituted of certain material bodies, the finest molecules, particles, etc., the carbons, etc., etc. The other hand, you have mind, and which is treated as a conscious one, which is free, etc., etc. Now, there is some kind of incompatibility between the two, and how do we can eliminate these difficulties? How can we make this, there is some compatibility there, mind body relations. Now, Searle is raising two important questions in this context. One is how human beings represent the world is something very significant. How essentially meaningless world contains meaning. Now, these two questions I think are very important to talk about the concept of mind, because in Ryle's discussion we found that dualism is threatened, we found that mentalism is also threatened, and most of the scientific analysis of the concept of mind, or the scientific explanation of the concept of mind after the 1950s onwards, the kind of literature which are being produced mostly are inclined to the development that are happening in science. Now, their inclination is probably acceptable. I mean, need to respect the scientific endeavor, which is very productive because we are finding more and more evidences with reference to our actions and with reference to our mind per se. So, the investigation that is carried out by science is certainly a fruitful exercise, no doubt about it. We have advanced in the direction of neurophysiology, neurobiology, psychology, artificial intelligence, etc., etc. Now, there are so many disciplines in science which are studying the concept of mind. What is human mind and how human mind can be explained in scientific terms. So, that is of course, is to be discussed, and people are debating on this issue. But what is important is whether there is a mind at all. Searle's first question talks about that. Now, how human beings represent the world? It is through human beings the world is being represented. So, it is through mind, in other words, it is through mind that the world is being represented, and Descartes was probably emphasizing on this, that there is representational mind. And look at his idea of clarity and distinctness, and Descartes mentions that if language intervenes, then the representation becomes some kind of a unclear one. Okay? So, I mean, this is particularly with reference to how do we know our mind. So, the moment I bring language, the moment I try to express myself, there is some kind of a gap found, but when I try to know myself, there is no such gap. So, that kind of thing is advocated by the mentalist. Mentalists find that mind is real and mind represents the world. Okay. And the other question which is important, how essentially meaningless world contains meaning. He says, if the world is constituted of material particles, then there is no meaning exist in these particles. There will be meaning if and only if there is meaner, there is a knower. It is the existence of the knower which we will talk about the meaning. So, meaning is meaning with reference to the existence of a person who means it. So, there is some kind of an epistemological concern, John Searle here, that Searle is not only talking about the ontology of the mind, okay, because unless the mind is real, it cannot represent the world. The other one is that there is a kind of an epistemological significance associated with this semantic enterprise which Searle is looking for, that without the knower, knowledge about the world is impossible. In other words, without a knower, the existence of world is meaningless. So, all this meaning that we talk about, it is with reference to the human society, with reference to human life as a whole. It is nothing to do with the world in itself. Now, there is of course, Searle says this discussion has some kind of a spillover effects. So, people have tried to look at human mind from the perspective of computer science or artificial intelligence. Now, people have really taken the question seriously. Is mind a machine? Is a question. Do we think like machines, or there is a ghost in the machine? What do we say? There is a little man in the brain which is thinking. So, this kind of debate is something very interesting, and we will be definitely talking about it in our future classes. So, Searle says, does a digital computer give us a right picture of the human mind? Is a question, because most of the cases when we find that our mind is been studied from the perspective of artificial intelligence, and the cognitive science claim is this, that mind is like a digital machine, and the way digital machine operates, mind operates in a similar way, and we will be discussing about it. Particularly, Professor Nath will be dealing extensively on this issue when he talks about why computer cannot think, and what kind of creativity computers will have, and what kind of creativity computers cannot have, or probably may not have the way we have seen computers. Now, coming back to Searle's discussion on dualism, Searle says mind body dualism has something to do with a kind of a stomach digestion problem. So, mind body problem is like a stomach digestion problem. Now, when we talk about the stomach, when you say that foods are digested in the stomach, now digested through a particular biological process. So, similarly mind is a reality to us because there is a brain. So, mind body problem for Searle is not a mind body problem, rather mind brain problem, and that is analogous to stomach digestion problem. The way brain processes things, it gives birth to consciousness. So, consciousness is in fact caused by the brain processes. So, that is why Searle says it is a mind brain issue. So, mind brain problem. And the other problem that he finds problematic is this, that in Descartes we are finding a different kind of vocabulary. Okay. Descartes and the critics of Descartes are concerned with some kind of categories, like either you are a monist or a dualist, either you are a materialist or a mentalist. If you are a materialist, then either you are a behaviorist or you are a physicalist, okay, or you are a functionalist. No, these kind of categories, the way the philosophers have explained mind with the help of these categories, are to be abandoned, are to be rejected, because those categories create enormous problem to us, and therefore, we do not see mind as it is, and it is for that mind body problem still remains a kind of an interesting philosophical problem to us. Now, once we start knowing about how the brain processes cause mind, probably we will not have the difficulties in understanding the concept of mind. So, Descartes is certainly concerned with the existence of mind. Now, the question is whether Searle is concerned with the mind. As I mentioned about these two questions before, that how human beings represent the world. Now, certainly Searle is not eliminating ontology of mind. Searle is also not avoiding the epistemological issue that is embedded in the discourse of mind. What is Searle's interest here? Searle is raising a different problem, and the problems are very important because there is an enormous development has happened in the scientific understanding of mind, and scientific understanding of mind gives a materialistic picture of mind, and that picture is like this. So, there is subjective conscious mental states are not real. In fact, they are reducible to anything else in the universe, quote unquote. Searle's words, they can be reducible to, and this reduction is a causal reduction. Okay? And there are several kinds of reduction. Searle talks about it in his work, The Rediscovery of Mind. We will come back to those criticism of Searle's against materialism, but Searle says materialism has somehow rejected the notion of mind. He says undermined the existence of mind, and that is what is not acceptable. Rather, for Searle, as I quote, consciousness is the central fact of specifically human aspects of our existence. Language, love, humor and so on would be impossible, unquote, without consciousness. So, without consciousness, all our human aspects of life is really meaningless, and that gives a clue how to talk about the ontology of mind. Okay. So, that is something very problematic. So, as I mentioned earlier, that Searle says there are 4 things we need to talk about, because these 4 things are important to us, and they are consciousness, intentionality, subjectivity and mental cognition. Now, all 4 things are problematic, and they are yet to be given proper scientific account. They are yet to be explained away by the materialists. So, as I mentioned earlier, that mind is caused by brain processes, or consciousness is caused by brain processes, and Searle's famous hypothesis is this, that mind is caused by brain processes and realized in brain processes. So, Searle says it is the brain processes which causes mind or consciousness, and again these conscious mental states which are caused by brain processes are realized in the brain processes. So, there is a kind of a causal connection Searle is talking about when he talks about mind and body relationship. Now, this causal connection is certainly different from the kind of causal connection which other emergentists are talking about. We will have exclusive discussion on the problem of emergentism, when we will discuss the famous emergentist Jagon Kim and Searle. How do they differ? Does Searle agree with emergentist notion of mind, or his notion of mind is something different? That we will see in a different context. But for today, let us accept this proposition of Searle, that mind is caused by brain processes, and that is how consciousness is being caused, and consciousness includes all kinds of mental states, conscious or unconscious. Now, all these mental states are intrinsically intentional. Mental states like belief, desire, hope, etc. are intentional mental states. Now, they are intentional because consciousness has this property called intentionality, and intentionality is intrinsically associated with consciousness. And otherwise, how can we say that the mind is about anything? How does a mind represent things? Now, this aboutness or offness is nothing but to talk about the intentionality of the mind, because certainly the brain, the stuff inside my head is not representing things directly. They do not really mean what they represent. They are just kind of facilitating the representation. So, the second question, look at the second question. How can it refer to anything? How can the brain refer to anything? So, there is certainly something that is consciousness, and it is that conscious mind which makes referential claims, and that reference happens if and only if there is intentionality intrinsic to the mind. So, therefore, it is the mind which represents the world. So, Searle is talking about intentionality, and his famous work Intentionality, which is published in Cambridge University Press in 1983, is something very important, a text on the philosophy of mind, and that is one of the original text of John Searle. Now, there the title of the text is Intentionality, an essay in philosophy of mind. Look at the next problem that Searle is talking about. Searle says it is not the problem of intentionality alone. Intentionality gives birth to another problem, that is subjectivity. So, human mental states are subjective. They are subjectively associated with mind or our self. So, for example, when I say I have pain, I look at this sensation from my own point of view. When I say that I have pain, I am looking at it from my own point of view. So, all the feelings, sensation and experiences that we are having, or all the mental states that we are having, are looked at from the subject's point of view, and that constitutes subjectivity. So, subjectivity is an epistemic category for Searle. Okay. We will come back to that, how Searle talks about ontology and epistemology of the mind later in our discussion on when we talk about the structure of mental states or the structure of mind. But the very fact that I am aware of myself, my intentional mental states which are internal to me are different from the mental states of yours or the mental states of other people is something very significant. He says those mental states are subjective, they are part of my consciousness, and similarly your conscious states or your intentional mental states or could be seen from your own point of view. So, there is some kind of a subjectivity which is associated with the problem of consciousness, the problem of mind, and that cannot be eliminated. And the other problem which Searle is talking about is the mental cognition. Searle says there is bodily activity. So, for example, look at Wittgenstein's famous statement, the hand is moving upward and I raise my hand. Now, the second statement, I raise my hand, is a kind of a voluntary action. Okay? And the reason for making this statement is that I intend to raise my hand up. By doing this, by performing this action, I am giving or I am generating a kind of a meaning to my action. But when I say that the hand is moving up, probably I am not voluntarily doing that. I am not voluntarily performing the action. Think of myself lying on the bed and I am conscious of it that the hand is going up and down, but I have no control over it. So, the bodily actions, bodily movements are performed, they are without having any control over it. Digestion is performed without my control over it. So, digestion, palpitations are not voluntary actions, they are biological actions. So, of the human organism. So, now similarly brain processes is happening, it is natural biological fact that brain processes will produce some amount of consciousness, some amount of mental states. So, brain processes do cause mental states, and Searle says when we talk about voluntary actions, we explain our voluntary action with reference to a particular mental states or with reference to a collection of mental states. So, that is the reason for my action. So, my action is intentional and there can be an intentional causal explanation of this voluntary action, that my hand is going up, and whereas the bodily movements or the existence of my body is possible because there is a gravitational force operating around me, that is making my making this possibility that I can sit on the chair and I will not fly in the sky. So, I am not going, my body will not go up. So, there is certainly a gravitational force operating in me. So, Searle is saying that there is a world and the world has a causal influence on the material body, and there is also a world called mind, which is part of that world, and that is causing voluntary actions. So, when he talks about meaning, when he talks about representation, it is at the second world. Of course, Searle does not speak in terms of this world, Searle does not say that there is a first world, second world or third world, but it is for our understanding I am making this statement that it is the mind, it is through mind that we make representations, and mind has a special role to play when it comes to our semantic activities, when it comes to our knowledge forming capacities, when it comes to our building up institutions, etc. So, Searle is talking in the language of 21st century. Searle is of course not really talking the way Descartes taught in 17th century. So, one of the problems that Searle says that let us do not talk about those categories of dualism, monism, pluralism, etc., etc. Let us talk about the kind of a reality which we are encountering. I think Searle's criticism against Descartes is something very significant in this context. Searle is not eliminating dualism. Searle probably does not believe in that kind of categories, but Searle is interested in this question, and many people have questioned Searle that Searle is committing a kind of a property dualism. We will see that in our next classes, but with this I would like to conclude that how Ryle's criticism is significant in the direction of understanding the concept of mind, and how Searle's criticism makes a fruitful exercise in analyzing the problem of mind. Thank you.